So, with most media projecting Joe Biden as the victor in the 2020 presidential election, there are now reports going around DC that Steve Mnuchin is done talking to Nancy Pelosi about stimulus, and that would mean the end of an era here on the channel, folks. So, before we say adieu to good old Steve Mnuchin, I thought I'd do a dedicated video on him once and for all, given that over the past 6 months or so, I've probably said his name more than the names of my wife and son combined. So let's talk about Stevie. He's not very popular in DC. Frankly, he's kind of just there, but he's an interesting guy. Like, he's made movies. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. He's got the trophy wife, almost 20 years younger than him. He owns a fat mansion in Bel Air. He was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. I mean, basically, as the son of a Goldman Sachs partner, he was born pretty much on home plate, or at least sliding into home plate. He's been able to accomplish something quite difficult, and that is to simultaneously be disliked by both Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell simultaneously. Like, basically everyone in Congress doesn't like the guy. So I got to thinking, why is Mnuchin the way he is? And I got to digging into it, and it turns out that a lot of people have speculated that Secretary Mnuchin is in fact a Democrat. And that's what I want to talk to you about in this video. But keep in mind that this is still a guy who worked on Donald Trump's campaign in 2016, and he was confirmed as Secretary of the Treasury by the Senate in 2017 by a vote that basically went along party lines. And one of the first things he said after being confirmed was that he wanted to use his position to help make America great again. Trump tagline, obviously. Since then, Mnuchin has pretty consistently supported Trump's tax cuts and some other conservative policies, so there have been a lot of indications that he's pretty clearly on the Republican side, at least on economic issues during the Trump administration. But is Steve just playing a role here? The first thing that made me question my assumption that Mnuchin is a strong Republican was a report about his history as a campaign donor. Even though he was a part of Trump's presidential campaign in 2016, he actually donated $2,000 to Kamala Harris's campaign for the U.S. Senate in the same year. And his ex-wife, Heather, followed that up with another donation of $2,700 early on in 2019 when Harris was getting ready to launch her campaign for president. Obviously, this was before Biden won the primary, and she became part of his ticket. So it's not like he donated to Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign or something like that. He wasn't necessarily going against Trump. But still, I don't think most Republicans were supporting Kamala Harris for Senate in 2016. Now, I don't want to read too much into his ex-wife's donations. She doesn't necessarily speak for him or vice versa, but it's interesting that they have a history of supporting Kamala Harris. Donation histories are actually public information, so you can look online and see which campaigns Steve Mnuchin has donated to over the years. He has a total of 89 listed donations going back to 1999. Unfortunately, they don't paint a very clear picture of his politics, but there are a lot of Democrats. There are a lot of Republicans, too, and a lot of interest groups like America Coming Together and the League of Conservation Voters. But you will recognize some of these names, and they might interest you. He donated to Chuck Schumer, to John Kerry, and yes, Barack Obama. He donated to Hillary Clinton a number of times, but he also donated to Giuliani in 2007, Mitt Romney in 2012, and a few other Republican politicians as well. Now, his donations have started to skew more toward Republicans and Republican organizations since he was linked to Trump's 2016 presidential campaign. So since 2016, he's donated to Trump, Paul Ryan, Scott Walker, and various Republican parties and organizations. But nevertheless, it's interesting that historically he has donated to people like Chuck Schumer and Barack Obama. Now, Mnuchin has described most of these donations as personal favors, so maybe there's nothing to read into here. But at the same time, I don't think most Republican politicians have a history of doing personal favors to Democratic candidates like Barack Obama. Another thing I think a lot of people don't know about Steve Mnuchin is that he actually has a history in Hollywood. Of course, he's known now more for politics than for movies, but he was in the private sector for most of his life up until joining the Trump campaign. Mnuchin founded a hedge fund called Dune Capital in 2004, which invested hundreds of millions of dollars in Hollywood movies, including Avatar, X-Men, and The Devil Wears Prada. This isn't something I thought I would ever say on this channel, but I'll put a link to Steve Mnuchin's IMDb page in the description below in case any of you want to see how many films he's been involved with. I'm not going to go through the full list, but he's credited as executive producer on some really big movies: Suicide Squad, American Sniper, Lego Batman, Wonder Woman, etc. Again, you don't necessarily need to be on the left to be in Hollywood, but I think it's clear that anyone who's involved in movies on that kind of scale is going to be rubbing elbows with a lot of Democrats and those who lean left. So if you're a hardcore Trumpkin, you might have some trouble in Tinseltown, but Mnuchin seemed to do okay for himself. Now, the main area where this has come up recently has been on stimulus. Obviously, the Republicans and the Democrats have been really far apart on this issue, and that gets complicated, right, when one party has the House of Representatives while the other has the Senate and the White House. So, of course, there was back and forth on stimulus for months. In most cases, neither side really saw eye to eye. There were some reports earlier in October that Republicans in the Senate weren't happy with how much Mnuchin was willing to give up to Pelosi and the Democrats when it came to the details of a potential second stimulus bill. You recall that some Republicans were even calling for Vice President Mike Pence to replace Secretary Mnuchin in stimulus negotiations because they felt that Pence would play a bit tougher with Democrats. Now, a lot of Senate Republicans were also concerned about overspending, especially with the national debt soaring. In fact, the total debt is expected to be greater than our annual GDP as soon as next year. Mnuchin, on the other hand, was willing to go up to $1.9 trillion in those pre-election stimulus negotiations, almost $2 trillion on second stimulus. Less, yes, it's lower than the HEROES Act that Pelosi wanted, but still $1.9 trillion was basically a non-starter for many GOP senators. You had folks like Rick Scott, Marsha Blackburn, Lamar Alexander, Mike Lee, all respected GOP senators, and there's a few of the high-profile politicians who voiced opposition to how close Trump and Mnuchin came to a second stimulus plan offered by Pelosi before the election. So ultimately, I can't tell you whether Steve Mnuchin is a Democrat, a Republican, or somewhere in between. But there are just a few pieces of evidence that indicate that he's not the typical Republican, at least to me. And of course, this could have played out in his unpopularity among Republicans in D.C. and how he's negotiated stimulus with Nancy Pelosi. So I know a lot of you have been following the stimulus negotiations along with me. I'm sure you have your own ideas on this, and it would be great to read your comments on Steve Mnuchin and how he has handled the stimulus negotiations throughout 2020. As always, make sure to hit the like button at the bottom if you enjoyed this video or learned something from it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.